The Incredible Journey by Sheila Burnford. Chapter 1. This journey took place in a part of Canada which lies in the northwestern part of the great sprawling province of Ontario. It is a vast area of deeply wooded wilderness, of endless chains of lonely lakes and rushing rivers, thousands of miles of country roads, rough timber lanes, overgrown tracks leading to abandoned mines, and unmapped trails snake across its length and breadth. It is a country of far-flung, lonely farms and a few widely scattered small towns and villages, of lonely trappers' shacks and logging camps. Most of its industry comes from the great pulp and paper companies who work their timber concessions deep in the very heart of the forests, and from the mines, for it is rich in minerals. Prospectors work through it. There are trappers and Indians, and sometimes hunters who fly into the virgin lakes in small amphibious aircrafts. There are pioneers with visions beyond their own lifespan, and there are those who have left the bustle of civilization forever to sink their identity into an unquestioning acceptance of the wilderness. But all these human beings together are as a handful of sand upon the ocean shores, and for the most part, there is silence and solitude and an uninterrupted way of life for the wild animals that abound there: moose and deer, brown and black bears, lynx and fox, beaver, muskrat and otter, fishers, mink, and marten. The wild duck rests there, and the Canada goose, for this is a fringe of the central migratory flyway. The clear tree-fringed lakes and rivers are filled with speckled trout and steelheads, pike and pickerel and whitefish. Almost half the year, the country is blanketed with snow, and for weeks at a time, the temperature may stay many degrees below zero. There is no slow growth of spring, but a sudden, short burst of summer, when everything grows with wild abandon, and as suddenly it is fall again. To many who live there, fall is the burnished crown of the year, with the crisp, sunny days and exhilarating air of the Northland, with clear blue skies and drifting leaves, and as far as the eye can see, the endless panorama of glorious, rich, flaming color in the turning trees. This is the country over which the three travelers passed, and it was in the fall that they traveled, in the days of Indian summer. John Longridge lived several miles from one of the small towns in an old stone house that had been in his family for several generations. He was a tall, austerely pleasant man of about 40, a bachelor and a writer by profession, being the author of several historical biographies. He spent much of his time traveling and gathering material for his books, but always returned to the comfortable old stone house for the actual writing. He liked the house to himself during these creative periods, and for many years had enjoyed an ideal arrangement whereby his domestic wants were cared for by a middle-aged couple, Mrs. Oakes and her husband Bert, who lived in a small cottage about half a mile away. Mrs. Oakes came in every day to look after the house and to cook the main meals. Bert was in charge of the furnace, the garden, and all the odd jobs. They came and went about their business without disturbing Longridge, and there was complete accord among them all. On the eve of the incredible journey, towards the end of September, Longridge sat by his crackling log fire in his comfortable library. The curtains were drawn, and the firelight flickered and played on the bookshelves and danced on the ceiling. The only other light in the room came from a small shaded lamp on a table by the deep armchair. It was a very peaceful room, and the only sound was the occasional crackling from the logs or the rustling of a newspaper, the pages of which Longridge turned with some difficulty, for a slender, wheat-colored Siamese cat was curled on his knee, chocolate-colored front paws curved in towards one another, sapphire eyes blinking occasionally as he stared into the fire. On the floor, his scarred, bony head resting on one of the man's feet, lay an old white English bull terrier. His slanted, almond-shaped eyes, sunk deep within their pinkish rims, were closed. One large triangular ear caught the firelight, flushing the inside a delicate pink so that it appeared almost translucent. Anyone unaccustomed to the rather peculiar points of a bull terrier beauty would have thought him a strange, if not downright ugly, dog, with the naked, down-faced arc of his profile, his deep-chested, stocky body, and whip-tapered tail. but the true lover of an ancient and honorable breed would have recognized the blood and bone of this elderly and rather battered body, would have known that in his prime this had been a magnificent specimen of compact sinew and muscle, bred to fight and endure, and would have loved him for his curious mixture of wicked, unyielding fighter, yet devoted and docile family pet, and above all, for the irrepressible air of sly merriment which gleamed in his little slant eyes. He twitched inside often in his sleep, as old dogs will, and for once his shabby tail, with the bare patch at the last joint, was still. By the door lay another dog, nose on paws, brown eyes open, and watchful in contrast to the peacefulness radiated by the other occupants of the room. This was a large red-gold Labrador retriever, a young dog with all the heritage of his sturdy working forebears in his powerful build, broad noble head and deep, blunt, gentle mouth. He lifted his head as Longridge rose from the chair, depositing the cat with an apologetic pet on the floor, and carefully moving his foot from under the old dog's head before walking across the room to draw one of the heavy curtains to look out. A huge orange moon was rising just above the trees at the far end of the garden, and a branch of an old lilac tree tapped in the window against the window pane. It was bright enough outside to see the garden in clear detail, and he noticed how the leaves had drifted again across the lawn, even in the short time since it had been raked that afternoon, and that only a few brave asters remained to color the flower beds. He turned and crossed the room, flicking on another light and opening a narrow cupboard halfway up the wall. Inside were several guns on racks, and he looked at them thoughtfully, running his fingers lovingly down the smooth grain of the hand-rubbed stocks, and finally lifting down a beautifully chased and engraved double-barreled gun. He broke it and peered down the gleaming barrels, and, as though at the signal, the young dog sat up silently in the shadows, his ears pricked in interest. The gun fell back into place with a well-oiled click, and the dog whined. The man replaced the gun in sudden contrition, and the dog lay down again, his head turned away, his eyes miserable. Longridge walked over to make amends for his thoughtlessness, but as he bent down to pat the dog, the telephone rang, so suddenly and shrilly in the quiet room that the cat jumped indignantly off the chair and the bull terrier started clumsily to his feet. Longridge picked up the receiver, and presently the breathless voice of Mrs. Oakes was heard, accompanied by a high-pitched whining note in the distance. "Speak up, Mrs. Oakes. I can hardly hear you." "I can hardly hear you either," said the breathless voice distantly. "There, is that better? I'm shouting now. What time are you leaving in the morning, Mr. Longridge?" "What's that? Could you talk louder?" "About 7 o'clock. I want to get to Heron Lake before nightfall," he shouted, noting with some amusement the scandalized expression of the cat. "But there's no need for you to be here at that time, Mrs. Oakes." "What's that you said? 7? Will it be all right if I don't come until about 9? My niece is coming on the early bus, and I'd like to meet her, but I don't like to leave the dogs alone too long." "Oh, of course you must meet her," he answered, shouting really loudly now as the humming noise increased. "The dogs will be fine. I'll take them out first thing in the morning, and—" "Oh, thanks, Mr. Longridge. I'll be there around 9 without fail. What's that you said about the animals? Oh, you persnickety-dratted old line. Don't you worry about them. Bert and me, we'll see. Tell old Bodger, bringing Marrowbone. Oh, wait till I give that operator a piece of my—" But just as Longridge was gathering strength for the last bellow into the mouthphone, the line went dead. He put the receiver back with relief and looked across the room at the old dog, who had climbed stealthily into the air chair and sat lolling back against the cushions, his eyes half closed, awaiting the expected reproof. He addressed him with the proper degree of ferocity, telling him that he was a scoundrelly opportunist, a barbarian, a disgrace to his upbringing and ancestors, and he paused in weighty emphasis, a very bad dog. At these two dread words, the terrier laid his ears flat against his skull, slanted his eyes back until they almost disappeared, then drew his lips back over his teeth in an apologetic grin, quivering the end of his disgraceful tail. His parody of sorrow brought its usual reprieve. The man laughed and patted the bony head, then enticed him down with the promise of a run. So the old dog, who was a natural clown, slithered half off the chair and stood, with his hind quarters resting on the cushions, waving his tail and nudging the cat, who sat like an Egyptian statue, eyes half closed, head erect, then gave a throaty growl and patted at the pink and black bull terrier nose. Then together they followed the man to the door, where the young dog waited to fall in behind the little procession. Longridge opened the door leading onto the garden, and the two dogs and the cat squeezed past his legs and into the cool night air. He stood under the trellised porch, quietly smoking his pipe, and watched them for a while. Their nightly routine never varied. First, the few minutes of separate local investigation, then the indefinable moment when all met again and paused before setting off together through the gap in the hedge at the bottom of the garden and into the field and woods that lay beyond. He watched until they disappeared into the darkness, the white shape of the bull terrier showing up after Longridge was unable to distinguish the other two, then re-entered the house. It would be half an hour or more before they returned. Longridge and his brother owned a small cabin by the shores of remote Heron Lake, about 200 miles away, and twice a year they spent 2 or 3 weeks there together, leading the life they loved, spending many hours in companionable silence in their canoe, fishing in the spring and hunting in the autumn. Usually, he had simply locked up and left, leaving the key with Mrs. Oakes so that she could come in once or twice a week and keep the house warm and aired. However, now he had the animals to consider. He had thought of taking them all to a boarding kennel in the town, but Mrs. Oakes, who loved the assorted trio, had protested vigorously and assented that she herself would look after them rather than have those poor dumb animals fretting themselves into a state in some kennel and probably half-starved in the bargain. So it had been arranged that she and Bert would look after the 3 animals. Bert would be working around the garden anyway, so that they could be outside most of the time, and Mrs. Oakes would feed them and keep her eye on them while she was working in the house. When he had finished packing, Longridge went into the library to draw the curtains, and seeing the telephone, he was reminded of Mrs. Oakes. He'd forgotten to tell her to order some coffee and other things that he had taken from the store cupboard. He sat down at the desk and drew out a small memo pad. "Dear Mrs. Oakes," he wrote, "please order some more coffee and replace the canned food I've taken. I will be taking the dogs, and Tao too, of course." Here he came to the end of the small square of paper, and taking another piece, he continued, "Out for a run before I leave, and I will give them something to eat, so don't let our greedy white friend tell you he is starving. Don't worry yourselves too much over them. I know they will be fine." He wrote the last few words with a smile, for the bull terrier had Mrs. Oakes completely in thrall and worked his advantage to the full. He left the pages on the desk under a glass paperweight, then opened the door in answer to a faint scratch. The old dog and the cat bounded in to greet him with their usual affection, bringing the fresh smell of the outdoors with them. The young dog followed more sedately and stood by, watching aloofly as the other whipped his tail like a lash against the man's legs, while the cat pressed against him, purring in a deep rumble, but he wagged his tail briefly and politely when the man patted him. The cat walked into the library to curl up on the warm hearth. Later, when the ashes grew cold, he would move to the top of the radiator, and then sometime in the middle of the night, he would steal upstairs and curl up beside the old dog. It was useless shutting the bedroom door, or any other door of the house for that matter, for the cat could open them all, latches or doorknobs. The only doors that defeated him were those with porcelain handles, for he found it impossible to get a purchase on the shiny surface with his long monkey-like paws. The young dog padded off to his rug on the floor in the little back kitchen, and the bull terrier started up the steep stairs and was already curled in his basket in the bedroom when Longridge himself came up to bed. He opened one bright, slanted eye when he felt the old blanket being dropped over him, then pushed his head under the cover, awaiting the opportunity he knew would come later. The man lay awake for a while, thinking about the days ahead and of the animals, for the sheer misery in the young dog's eyes haunted him. They had come to him, this odd and lovable trio, over 8 months ago, from the home of an old and dear college friend. This friend, Jim Hunter, was an English professor in the small university about 250 miles away. As the university owned one of the finest reference libraries in the province, Longridge often stayed with him and was in fact godfather to the Hunters' 9-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. He'd been staying with them when the invitation came from the English university asking the professor to deliver a series of lectures which would involve a stay in England of nearly 9 months, and he had witnessed the tears of his goddaughter and the glum silence of her brother, Peter, when it was decided that their pets would have to be boarded out and the house rented to the reciprocal visiting professor. Longridge was extremely fond of Elizabeth and Peter, and he could understand their feelings, remembering how much the companionship of a Cocker Spaniel had meant when he himself was a rather lonely child, and how he had grieved when he was first separated from it. Elizabeth was the self-appointed owner of the cat. She fed and brushed him, took him for walks, and he slept at the foot of her bed. 11-year-old Peter had been inseparable from the bull terrier ever since the small white puppy had arrived on Peter's first birthday. In fact, the boy could not remember a day of his life when Bodger had not been part of it. The young dog belonged, in every sense of the word, heart and soul, to their father, who had trained him since puppyhood for hunting. Now they were faced with the realization of separation, and in the appalled silence that followed the decision, Longridge watched Elizabeth's face screw up in the prelude to tears. Then he heard a voice, which he recognized with astonishment to be his own, telling everybody not to worry at all. He would take care of everything. Were not he and the animals already well known to one another? And had he not plenty of room and a large garden? Mrs. Oakes, why, she would love to have them. Everything would be simply wonderful. Before the family sailed, they would bring the dogs and the cat over by car, see for themselves where they would sleep, write out a list of instructions, and he personally would love and cherish them until their return. So one day, the Hunter family had driven over and the pets had been left, with many tearful farewells from Elizabeth and last-minute instructions from Peter. During the last few days, Longridge had almost regretted his spontaneous offer. The terrier had languished in his basket, his long arched nose buried in the comfort of his paws, and one despairing, martyred eye haunting his every movement. And the cat had nearly driven him crazy with the incessant goat-like bleating and yowling of a suffering Siamese. The young dog had moped by the door and refused all food. But after a few days, won over perhaps by Mrs. Oak's sympathetic clucking and tempting morsels of food, they had seemed to resign themselves, and the cat and the old dog had settled in very comfortably and happily, showing their adopted master a great deal of affection. It was very apparent, however, how much the old dog missed children. Longridge at first had wondered where he disappeared to some afternoons. He eventually found out that the terrier went to the playground of the little rural school where he was a great favorite with the children, timing his appearance for recess. Knowing that the road was forbidden to him because of his poor sight and habit of walking stolidly in the middle, he had found a shortcut across the intervening fields. But the young dog was very different. He had obviously never stopped pining for his own home and master. Although he ate well and his coat was glossy with health, he never maintained anything but a dignified, unyielding distance. The man respected him for this, but it worried him that the dog never seemed to relax and always seemed to be listening, longing and waiting for something far beyond the walls of the house or the fields beyond. Longridge was glad for the dog's sake that the Hunters would be returning in about 3 weeks, but he knew that he would miss his adopted family. They had amused and entertained him more than he would have ever thought possible over the months, and he realized that the parting would be a real wrench, but he did not like to think of the too-quiet house that would be his again. He slept at last, and the dreaming, curious moon peeped in at the window to throw shafts of pale light into the room and over each of the sleeping occupants. They woke the cat downstairs, who stretched and yawned, then leaped without visible effort onto the windowsill, his gleaming eyes with their slight cast wide open and enormous, and only the tip of his tail twitching as he sat motionless, staring into the garden. Presently he turned, and with a single graceful bound crossed to the desk. But for once he was careless, and his hind leg knocked the glass paperweight to the floor. He shook the offending leg vigorously, scattering the pages of Longridge's note, sending one page of the desk into the air, where it caught the upward current of hot air from the wall register and sailed across the room to land in the fireplace. Here it slowly curled and browned until nothing remained of the writing but the almost illegible signature at the bottom. When the pale fingers of the moon searched out over the young dog in the back kitchen, he stirred in his uneasy sleep, then sat upright, his ears pricked, listening and listening for the sound that never came, the high, piercing whistle of his master that would have brought him bounding across the world if only his straining ears could hear it. And lastly, the moon peered into the upstairs bedroom, where the man lay sleeping on his side in a great four-poster bed, and curled against the back, the elderly, comfort-loving white bull terrier slept in blissful, warm content. Chapter 2. There was a slight mist when John Longridge woke early the next morning, having fought a losing battle for the middle of the bed with his uninvited bedfellow. He shaved and dressed quickly, watching the mist roll back over the fields and the early morning sun break through. It would be a perfect fall day, an Indian summer day, warm and mellow. Downstairs, he found the animals waiting patiently by the door for their early morning run. He let them out, then cooked and ate his solitary breakfast. He was out in the driveway loading up his car when the dogs and cat returned from the fields. He fetched some biscuits for them, and they lay by the wall of the house in the early sun watching him. He threw the last item into the back of the car, thankful that he had already packed the guns and the hunting equipment before the Labrador had seen them, then walked over and patted the heads of his audience, one by one. "Be good," he said. "Mrs. Oakes will be here soon. Goodbye," he said to the Labrador. "I wish I could have taken you with me, but there wouldn't be room in the canoe for 3 of us." He put his hand under the young dog's soft muzzle. The golden brown eyes looked steadily into his, and then the dog did an unexpected thing. He lifted his right paw and placed it in the man's hand. Longridge had seen him do this many a time to his own master, and he was curiously touched and affected by the trust it conveyed, almost wishing he did not have to leave immediately, just after the dog had shown his first responsive gesture. He looked at his watch and realized he was already late. He had no worries about leaving the animals alone outside, as they had never attempted to stray beyond the large garden and the adjacent fields, and they could return inside the house if they wished, for the kitchen door was the kind that closed slowly on a spring. All that he had to do was shoot the inside bolt while the door was open, and after that it did not close properly and could be pushed open from the outside. They looked contented enough too. The cat was washing methodically behind his ears. The old dog sat on his haunches, panting after his run, his long pink tongue lolling out of his grinning mouth, and the Labrador lay quietly by his side. Longridge started the car and waved to them out the window as he drove slowly down the drive, feeling rather foolish as he did so. "What do I expect them to do in return?" he asked himself with a smile. "Wave back? Or shout goodbye? The trouble is, I've lived too long alone with them, and I'm becoming far too attached to them." The car turned around the bend at the end of the long tree-lined drive, and the animals heard the sound of the engine receding in the distance. The cat transferred his attention to a hind leg. The old dog stopped panting and lay down. The young dog remained stretched out, only his eyes moving, and an occasional twitch of his nose. 20 minutes passed by, and no move was made. Then suddenly, the young dog rose, stretched himself, and stood looking intently down the drive. He remained like this for several minutes, while the cat watched closely, one leg still pointing upwards. Then slowly, the Labrador walked down the driveway and stood at the curve, looking back as though inviting the others to come. The old dog rose too now, somewhat stiffly, and followed. Together, they turned the corner out of sight. The cat remained utterly still for a full minute, blue eyes blazing in the dark mask. Then, with a curious, hesitating run, he set off in pursuit. The dogs were waiting by the gate when he turned the corner. the old dog peering wistfully back as though he hoped to see his friend Mrs. Oakes materialize with a juicy bone. But when the Labrador started up the road, he followed. The cat still paused by the gate, one paw lifted delicately in the air, undecided, questioning, hesitant, until suddenly some inner decision reached. He followed the dogs. Presently, all three disappeared from sight down the dusty road, trotting briskly and with purpose. About an hour later, Mrs. Oakes walked up the driveway from her cottage, carrying a string bag with her working shoes and apron, and a little parcel of tidbits for the animals. Her placid, gentle face wore a rather disappointed look, because the dogs usually spied her long before she got to the house and would rush to greet her. "I expect Mr. Longridge left them shut inside the house if he was leaving early," she consoled herself, but when she pushed open the kitchen door and walked inside, everything seemed very silent and still. She stood at the front of the stairs and called them, but there was no answering patter of running feet, only the steady tick-tock of the old clock in the hallway. She walked through the silent house and out into the front garden and stood there calling with a puzzled frown. "Oh, well," she spoke her thoughts aloud to the empty, sunny garden. "Perhaps they've gone up to the school. It's a funny thing, though," she continued, sitting on a kitchen chair a few minutes later and tying her shoelaces, "that Puss isn't here. He's usually sitting on the window sill at this time of the day. Oh, well, he's probably out hunting. I've never known a cat like that for hunting. Doesn't seem natural somehow." She washed and put away the few dishes, then took her cleaning materials into the sitting room. There her eye was caught by a sparkle on the floor by the desk, and she found the glass paperweight, and after that, the remaining sheet of the note on the desk. She read it through to where it said, "I will be taking the dogs, and Dal too, of course," then looked for the remainder. "That's odd," she thought. "Now where would he take them? That cat must have knocked the paperweight off last night. The rest of the note must be somewhere in this room." She searched the room, but it was not until she was emptying an ashtray into the fireplace that she noticed the charred curl of paper in the hearth. She bent down and picked it up carefully, for it was obviously very brittle. But even then, most of it crumbled away, and she was left with a fragment which bore the initials J.R.L. "Now, isn't that the strangest thing?" she said to the fireplace, rubbing vigorously at the black marks on the tile. "He must mean he's taken them all to Heron Lake with him. But why would he suddenly do that after all the arrangements we made? He never said a word about it on the telephone. Oh, but wait a minute, I remember now. He was just going to say something about them when the line went dead. Perhaps he was going to tell me." While Mrs. Oakes was amazed that Longridge would take the animals on his vacation, it did not occur to her to be astonished that a cat should go along too, for she was aware that the cat loved the car and always went with the dogs when Longridge drove them anywhere or took them farther afield for walks. Like many Siamese cats, he was as obedient and as trained to go on walks as most dogs, and would always return to a whistle. Mrs. Oakes swept and dusted and talked to the house, locked it, and returned home to her cottage. She would have been horrified to the depths of her kindly, well-ordered soul if she had known the truth. Far from sitting sedately in the back of a car traveling north with John Longridge, as she so fondly visualized, the animals were by now many miles away on a deserted country road that ran westward. They had kept a fairly steady pace for the first hour or so, falling into an order which was not to vary for many miles or days. The Labrador ran always by the left shoulder of the old dog, for the bull terrier was very nearly blind in his left eye, and they jogged along fairly steadily together, the bull terrier with his odd rolling sailor-like gait, and the Labrador in a slow lope. Some 10 yards behind came the cat, whose attention was frequently distracted when he would stop for a few minutes and then catch up again. But in between these halts he ran swiftly and steadily, his long, slim body and tail low to the ground. When it was obvious that the old dog was flagging, the Labrador turned off the quiet gravel road and into the shade of a pine wood beside a clear, fast-running creek. The old dog drank deeply, standing up to his chest in the cold water. The cat picked his way delicately to the edge of an overhanging rock. Afterwards, they rested in the deep pine needles under the trees, the terrier panting heavily, with his eyes half closed, and the cat busy with his eternal washing. They lay there for nearly an hour, until the sun struck through the branches above them. The young dog rose and stretched, then walked towards the road. The old dog rose too, stiff-legged, his head low. He walked toward the waiting Labrador, limping slightly and wagging his tail at the cat, who suddenly danced into a patch of sunlight, struck at the drifting leaf, then ran straight at the dogs, swerving at the last moment, and as suddenly sitting down again. They trotted steadily on all that afternoon, mostly traveling on the grassy verge at the side of the quiet country road, sometimes in the low, overgrown ditch that ran alongside, if the acute hearing of the young dog warned them of an approaching car. By the time the afternoon sun lay in long, barred shadows across the road, the cat was still traveling in smooth, swift bursts, and the young dog was comparatively fresh. But the old dog was very weary, and his pace had dropped to a limping walk. They turned off the road into the bush at the side and walked steadily through in a clearing in the trees, pushing their way through the tangled undergrowth at the far end. They came out upon a small open place where a giant spruce had crashed to the ground and left a hollow where the roots had been, filled now with drifted dry leaves and spruce needles. The late afternoon sun slanted through the branches overhead, and it looked invitingly snug and secure. The old dog stood for a minute, his heavy head hanging and his tired body swaying slightly, then lay down on his side in the hollow. The cat, after a good deal of wary observation, made a little hollow among the spruce needles and curled around in it, purring softly. The young dog disappeared into the undergrowth and reappeared presently, his smooth coat dripping water, to lie down a little way apart from the others. The old dog continued to pant exhaustedly for a long time, one hind leg shaking badly until his eyes closed at last. The labored breaths came further and further apart, and he was sleeping still, save for an occasional leg shudder. Later on, when darkness fell, the young dog moved over and stretched out closely at his side, and the cat stalked over to lie between his paws, and so warmed and comforted by their closeness, the old dog slept, momentarily unconscious of his aching, tired body or his hunger. In the nearby hills, a timber wolf howled mournfully. Owls called and answered and glided silently by with great outspread wings, and there were faint whispers of movement and small rustling noises around all through the night. Once an eerie wail like a baby's crying woke the old dog and brought him shivering and whining to his feet, but it was only a porcupine who scrambled noisily and clumsily down a nearby tree trunk and waddled away, still crying softly. When he lay down again, the cat was gone from his side, another small night hunter slipping through the unquiet shadows that froze to stillness at his passing. The young dog slept in fitful, uneasy starts, his muscles twitching, constantly lifting his head and growling softly. Once he sprung to his feet with a full-throated roar, which brought a sudden splash in the distance, then silence, and who knows what else, unknown, unseen, or unheard, passed through his mind to disturb him further. Only one thing was clear and certain, that at all costs he was going home. Home to his own beloved master. Home lay to the west, his instinct told him, but he could not leave the other two, so somehow he must take them with him all the way.